He was the pastor everyone respected. No one knew what he did after church. A dead man's secret can destroy the living. Remember that. Because what this village uncovered about their most beloved pastor, the man they sang hymns for, the man who prayed over their sick children, the man who baptized their babies, was so devastating that some of them never set foot in a church again. And the worst part, the signs were there all along. Nobody wanted to see them. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me what country you're watching from. We've got viewers joining us from Ghana, Nigeria, the UK, the US. I want to know where you are tonight. Now, let's go. The village of Atwa-Nyankwanta sat tucked between two hills in the Ashanti region. The kind of place where everybody knew your grandmother's nickname and your grandfather's debts. It was a tight community. 4,000 people, one market, 2 funerals a month, and one church that sat in the center of everything like a heartbeat. That church was called Grace Abundant Chapel, and its pastor was a man named Reverend Alex Asante Boating. Alex Asante Boating was not a tall man, but he had a presence that filled rooms, broad-shouldered, with deep-set eyes that seemed to hold genuine warmth, and a voice, that voice, that could make a stone feel guilty for its sins. He had come to Atwa-Nyankwanta 15 years ago, a young seminary graduate from Kumasi, with nothing but a worn Bible, a second-hand suit, and what everyone described as a spirit that seemed touched by God himself. Within 5 years, he had doubled the congregation. Within 10, he had built a new church hall, started a school feeding program for 300 children, and personally negotiated with the district assembly to repair the road that connected the village to the main highway. People didn't just respect Reverend Alex. They loved him the way you love a father who actually stayed. His wife, Mame Akwa, was quieter. Pretty in the way that doesn't demand attention, with close-cropped natural hair and hands that were always doing something. Cooking, sewing, plaiting a child's hair. She taught Sunday school and ran the women's prayer group on Thursdays. People said she was the pastor's anchor, his calm. You never saw one before eventually seeing the other. They had 2 children, a teenage son named Nana who was brilliant and wanted to study medicine, and a younger daughter, little Abena, who was 8 years old and had her father's eyes and her mother's quiet soul. This was a family that looked like a blessing. And in Atwa-Nyankwanta, blessings were not questioned, they were received. Until the evening, Deacon Kwajo found the notebook. Deacon Kwajo Mensah had worked beside Reverend Alex for 11 years. He was a retired school teacher, lean and precise in the way that old teachers often are. With wire-rimmed glasses, he was always pushing back up his nose. He loved Reverend Alex like a brother, which is what made what happened next so complicated. It was a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after finding the notebook. Deacon Kwajo went to Reverend Alex's house before dawn. He knocked, he waited. He knocked again. Mami Akwa opened the door, saw his face, and called her husband. The 2 men sat in the parlor. Mami Akwa, sensing something that wives always sense before anyone tells them anything, went to the kitchen and stayed there. Kwajo did not waste time. He was a school teacher. He had spent decades dealing with students who thought they could hide things. He looked at Reverend Alex and said quietly, "I found the notebook." What happened next surprised him. Reverend Alex did not deny it. He did not get angry. He did not reach for scripture. He sat very still for a long moment, and then he put his face in his hands, and he wept. Not the performative weeping of a man trying to deflect. Real weeping. The kind that comes from somewhere deep and broken and long suppressed. His shoulders shook. His breath came in ragged pulls. And when he finally lifted his face, his eyes were red, and his voice had lost all its pulpit power. He said, "It's not what you think." Kwajo waited. "Afianda Akwa," Reverend Alex said, his voice barely above a whisper, "is my sister." The silence that followed lasted a long time. This is the part of the story that the village of Atwe Nkwanta would argue about for years afterward. Because what Reverend Alex told Deacon Kwadwo that morning was not the story of an affair. It was a story that had been buried for 30 years, and it was far darker than anyone had imagined. Alex Asante Asamoah Boateng had not always been the man the village knew. Before seminary, before the church, before Atwe Nkwanta, there had been a different life, a life he had fled. He had grown up in a town called Swame, raised by a single mother who had 2 other children from 2 different men. When his mother died, he was 17. The children were separated. The older ones went to different relatives. A baby girl, barely 6 months old, went to a distant aunt in Bronkuru. That baby girl was Afia. Alex had not known she existed until 4 years ago when his mother's sister, an old woman dying in a hospital in Accra, called him to her bedside and told him. She handed him a photograph. She told him the aunt in Bronkuru had raised the child, that the child had grown, married, been widowed, and was now alone with her own son of her own. Alex had found her. He had driven to Bronkuru and stood outside her compound for an hour before he knocked. When he finally introduced himself, Afia had screamed, not in fear, in relief. She had been told she had a brother somewhere. She had never known how to find him. They met in secret because Alex was afraid, not of scandal, though he knew how it would look. He was afraid because he had built his identity in Atwe Nkwanta as a man without complications, a man whose past was clean. He had never told Maami Akwa the full story of his childhood, the poverty, the chaos, the shame of a fractured family that did not look like what a pastor's biography was supposed to look like. The notebook was not a record of meetings with a lover. It was a record of visits to a sister he was slowly, carefully working up the courage to bring into his life properly. The coded entries, the hidden dates, those were the marks of a man not hiding sin, but hiding shame. Kwadwo sat very still. He pushed his glasses up his nose. He thought about the 11 years he had worked beside this man, the trust, the shared prayers, the funerals they had officiated together, the times Reverend Alex had counseled him through his own marital difficulties years ago. He thought about what he had almost done, what he was on the verge of doing, with what he thought he knew. "You should have told her," Kwadwo said finally. "Your wife. Your congregation doesn't need to know everything, but your wife does." Reverend Alex nodded. He already knew. That was the real weight he had been carrying. Not the secret of Afia's existence, but the shame that had kept him from being fully honest with the woman who had shared his life and his bed and his ministry for 19 years. Kwadwo stood up to leave. Then he stopped. "There's something else," Reverend Alex said, and Kwadwo sat back down. What the Reverend said next was not about Afia. It was about the church accounts. For 3 years, carefully, in small amounts, through a routing so complex that Kwadwo had never caught it in his monthly reconciliations, someone had been taking money from Grace Abundance Chapel's building fund, the fund for the new church hall extension, money the congregation had sacrificed for, school fees forgone, market profits donated, old women's savings given in faith. It amounted to nearly 47,000 Ghana cedis. Kwadwo's heart stopped. He was the deacon of accounts. If money had been stolen from this church, that failure was partly his. The question was not just who had stolen it. The question was how, and whether the trail led where Reverend Alex seemed to be suggesting it led. "Show me," Kwadwo said. They spent the next 4 hours in the church office. Reverend Alex pulled files that Kwadwo had never been given access to, supplementary records, a second ledger he had not known existed.
And as the morning light grew, and the birds outside grew loud, and the market women began calling their goods in the distance, the picture took shape. The money had been moved through a subsidiary account, an account opened in the name of the church's development committee, an account that required 2 signatures to access. One was Reverend Alex's, the other was a name that made Kwadwo feel as though the floor had tilted beneath him. Elder Fifi Tawia. Elder Fifi Tawia was the chairman of the church board. He was 61 years old, wealthy by village standards, with a cement business and 3 houses, and a voice that boomed even louder than the reverend's when he wanted it to. He was also Kwadwo's wife's uncle. He was also the man who had been most vocal at every board meeting for the past year in pushing for a full financial audit of the church. An audit that, if conducted thoroughly, might have uncovered what he himself had done. The audacity of it, the sheer architecture of the betrayal. A man calling for transparency to prevent anyone from looking too closely. A man attending church every Sunday, taking communion, shaking hands, slapping backs, all while bleeding the congregation dry.
"How long have you known?" Kwadwo asked. "I found it 8 months ago," Reverend Alex said. "I've been trying to find a way to handle it that doesn't destroy the church." Kwadwo took his glasses off. He cleaned them. He put them back on. "Why didn't you come to me?" Reverend Alex looked at him for a long moment. "Because Fifi Tawia is your wife's uncle, and I was not sure, I was not certain where that loyalty would lie." It was the most honest thing a pastor had ever said to him, and it hurt more than he expected. The next Sunday, Atwa and Kwanta woke the way it always did. Roosters, smoke from morning fires, children in school uniforms, the smell of groundnut soup drifting from the market. Grace Abundant Chapel filled at 8 o'clock. The choir sang. The announcements were made. Elder Fifi Tawia sat in his usual place in the 3rd row, his suit pressed, his Bible open on his knee, his wife beside him in a green head wrap. He smiled at people. He shook hands. He was, as always, the picture of a godly elder. Reverend Alex climbed to the pulpit. He did not preach the sermon he had prepared. Instead, he spoke for 20 minutes about something he called the weight of silence. About the things men carry alone because they are afraid of what the truth will cost them. About the difference between protecting a community and deceiving it. About how a lie of omission is still a lie, even when its motive seems kind. People shifted in their seats. Some thought he was talking about personal spiritual matters. Some thought he was being unusually intense.
Elder Fifi Tawia watched him with a perfectly neutral expression. And then Reverend Alex said, "There is a matter before this church that can no longer remain in the dark." He looked at the congregation. He looked specifically at Elder Fifi Tawia. An amount of 47,000 Ghana cedis has been removed from the building fund of Grace Abundant Chapel over the past 3 years. This has been verified by independent accountants. Yes, I said independent accountants who are engaged privately 2 months ago. The findings have been submitted to the District Church Authority and to the police. The accounts are frozen. The investigation is underway. The silence in that church was the kind that you could almost touch. It had weight. It had texture. And then someone began to cry. And then someone else. And then the sound rose. Not anger. Not yet. But grief. The grief of people who had given what little they had and discovered it had been taken from them by someone they had trusted. Elder Fifi Tawia stood up. He did not confess. He was not that man. He said in his booming voice that these were lies, that this was a conspiracy, that Reverend Alex had always been jealous of his influence in the church, that this was an attack
on a man of God by a lesser man of God. And then Deacon Kwadwo Mensah Ofori, quiet, precise, wire-rimmed glasses, retired school teacher, stood up from his seat in the congregation and said, "Sit down, uncle." Not Elder Tawia, uncle. The word stripped every title from the man like bark from a tree. "I have seen the documents. The signatures are yours. The transfers are documented. Sit down." Fifi Tawia sat down. He sat down because in that room, in that moment, he had nothing left to stand on. The investigation took 4 months. In the end, Elder Fifi Tawia repaid the full amount, not from goodwill, but from the threat of prosecution. His cement business paid it. His second house was liquidated. His wife left him for a period of 6 months, though she eventually returned. He did not come back to Grace Abundant Chapel. He moved his membership to a church in the next district, where nobody knew his name in the specific way that Atui and Kwanta now knew it.
Reverend Alex told Mame Akua the truth about Afia. He told her everything. The childhood, the separation, the dying aunt in Accra, the year of secret visits. He told her all of it, sitting at their kitchen table at midnight while the children slept. Mame Akua was quiet for a long time after he finished. Then she said, "Why didn't you just tell me?" He said he didn't know, which was probably the most honest thing he had ever admitted in his entire life. She said, "I want to meet her." The following month, Afia Dakwa came to Atui and Kwanta for the first time, not as a visitor slipping quietly into a back pew, but as family. Mame Akua cooked a full meal. The children were introduced to an aunt they hadn't known they had. Little Abina, who had her father's eyes and her mother's quiet soul, took Afia's hand within 10 minutes and didn't let go for the rest of the afternoon. Deacon Kwadwo submitted his resignation from the accounts committee 3 times. Reverend Alex refused it 3 times. They argued about it properly, the way old friends argue, fiercely and briefly and with mutual respect. In the end, Kwadwo stayed. A new oversight structure was put in place. 3 independent signatories, quarterly external audits, nothing hidden, nothing assumed. The building fund was rebuilt in 2 years. Not because the congregation was rich, but because the story got out, the real story, not the gossip version. And people from Accra and Kumasi and even from abroad sent donations. A church that had been robbed and had stood up and named the thief seemed to a lot of people like a church worth supporting.
The new church hall was completed on the 3rd year. At the dedication, Reverend Alex stood at the pulpit and said something that nobody forgot. This building was paid for twice. Once with money, once with truth. The second payment was harder. It was also more valuable. Now, here is the part of this story that stays with me. The part that I think about late at night when I'm trying to understand human beings and why we do what we do. Kwadwo found that notebook by accident. He almost destroyed a man's reputation based on what he thought he knew. He was 6 weeks, maybe 2 more sleepless nights away from going to Mama Akua or to the church board or to someone who would have set fire to something that didn't need burning.
And Reverend Alex, a man carrying the secret of a stolen sister and the secret of a stolen church fund, told neither to the man standing right beside him, the man who could have helped him carry both because he was afraid of what loyalty looked like when it was tested.
both men were protecting something. Both men were doing it alone. And that aloneness almost ended everything. Elder Fifi Tawia, in his arrogance, thought the safest place to hide a crime was behind the face of a righteous man. He attended church. He called for audits. He shook hands and read scripture and came to prayer meetings. And it worked. For 3 years it worked. Because nobody looks for the wolf when the wolf looks exactly like everyone else. That is the oldest trick in the oldest book. And yet generation after generation, it still works. Until someone drops something. Until a notebook falls from a shelf. Until one night, one man cannot sleep and goes to another man's door before dawn. The village of Atuya and Kwanta did not stop being faithful after all this. They did not abandon the church or abandon God or abandon each other. What they did was stop being quiet about things that should not be quiet. They started asking questions. They started expecting answers. They started understanding that reverence for a person and accountability from that person are not opposites. They are in fact the same thing, expressed differently. Because you cannot truly honor someone by refusing to hold them to the standard they claim to represent. And because in a small village between two hills, where everybody knows your grandmother's nickname and your grandfather's debts, the most dangerous thing is not a secret. The most dangerous thing is the silence that protects it. Reverend Alex Asante Boateng remained the pastor of Grace Abundant Chapel for another 11 years after all of this. He retired at 62. On his last Sunday, the church was so full that people stood outside the windows and the doors, listening through the walls. Mami Akwa sat in the front pew. Beside her sat Afia Dakwa, wearing a yellow head wrap and holding little Abina's hand. Abina, who was no longer little, who was now in medical school, who had her father's eyes and her mother's quiet soul, and her auntie's fierce, unbreakable grip. Deacon Kwaju, 71 years old now, stood at the back of the church.
When the service ended and people pressed forward to embrace the retiring pastor, Kwado waited. He always waited. When the crowd thinned, he made his way to the front, put his hand on the reverend's shoulder, and said nothing. Reverend Alex put his hand over Kwado's hand, and they stood there for a moment. Two old men who had carried something together that neither could have carried alone. And the look between them was the kind that doesn't need words. Some things, by the time they are finished, have already said everything. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about something or someone in your own life, I want to hear about it in the comments below. What part hit you the hardest? The betrayal? The secret sister? The man hiding a crime behind the face of piety? Tell me. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is exactly the right moment. This channel is about stories like this one, true to the human heart, rooted in African soil, carrying lessons that travel everywhere. Hit subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And I'll see you in the next story.